I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The HOA locked our kids out on Christmas Eve. My brother, he turned their clubhouse into a no-go zone overnight. They bragged about rules. We brought permits, cameras, and a little surprise. Let me take you back. Christmas Eve had always felt like a gentle pause in the chaos of suburban life, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a worn sweater. This year, though, quiet carried a sharp edge. I stood in the backyard, the faint scent of BBQ smoke still clinging stubbornly to the air, and watched Jamie and Lily press their small faces against the chain link of the playground gate. The swings sat motionless, untouched in the crisp snow, their metal chains glinting under the pale winter sun. And then it hit me, the gate was locked. I held the certified letter in my hand again, feeling the paper tremble slightly against my fingers. One moment I was planning hot cocoa and gingerbread, the next I was staring at a printed declaration of restriction, HOA rules banning my children from their own playground. The words felt heavier than any brick, each sentence another nail in a coffin of holiday cheer. My heart sank in ways I hadn't expected. Across the yard, Karen's sharp gaze tracked every movement, her clipboard tucked tightly against her chest. She scribbled notes with precision, a faint crease between her brows betraying her concentration. There was no warmth, no sense of compromise, only the rigid authority of someone who seemed to revel in overreach. The email from the HOA board had already hinted at this, a tone so exacting it left little room for interpretation, and here she was living it out in person. Jamie tugged on my coat sleeve. "Dad, why can't we play?" His voice carried the mixture of confusion and hurt that only 8-year-olds can perfect. Lily, standing beside him, wrapped her small hands around the cold metal, pressing her forehead against it as if willing it to open. I crouched to their level, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Sometimes adults make rules we don't understand," I said, but even as I spoke I knew it sounded hollow. The swing's chains clinked slightly in the breeze, a tiny metallic echo of the disappointment hanging over the yard. I felt the wind bite my cheeks and realized I was shivering not from cold, but from that peculiar cocktail of shock and helplessness. The wind carried with it the faint, lingering aroma of last night's BBQ, a reminder that life had moments of warmth, even when everything else seemed harsh. I let that smell anchor me, and yet my mind raced. How had a neighborhood board sworn to community well-being come to wield such unilateral power over children on Christmas Eve? Karen's pen scratched against the clipboard again, a sound that seemed amplified in the cold stillness. I noticed the little wind chime hanging by the porch, the one that had sung cheerily all summer. Its metal tubes jingled softly with each gust, a fragile music that contrasted sharply with the rigidity of Karen's enforcement. I caught myself staring at it, a small, almost ridiculous symbol of innocence and continuity in a world suddenly dictated by letters and bylaws. That wind chime, I realized, would be my anchor. My quiet reminder that the world was not entirely consumed by the absurdity before me. Marlene appeared beside me, her scarf wrapped tightly, face pale from cold and worry. She gave me a glance, her lips pressed together in the kind of silent support that spoke volumes. "Garrett, we'll figure this out," she whispered, but her own hands shook, mirroring my own. I nodded, grateful for the shared burden, yet the letter's weight pressed on my chest as though it were a physical object. I knelt and handed the letter to Jamie and Lily. Their little fingers brushed the crisp edges, and I saw the disappointment mirrored in their eyes. The snowflakes settled on their hair, tiny cold specks that made the moment even more poignant. How could a certified notice feel like such an injustice? The swings remained frozen in place, indifferent to my attempts to console them. A stark reminder that bureaucracy had its own unfeeling rhythm. The realization hit fully. Then the holiday plans I had imagined, the warmth and laughter I had anticipated, had been disrupted. My children's innocent joy had been supplanted by confusion, and I had no immediate recourse. For the first time, I felt the brittle edge of helplessness, a sensation I wasn't prepared for on a day meant for comfort and celebration. I straightened, brushing snow from my sleeves, and glanced once more at Karen. She looked satisfied with her work, unaware or indifferent to the small devastation she had sown. I wondered if any adult would question this madness, if anyone else could see how absurd it had become. Or was this the new normal, where authority lurked behind letters and cold metal gates and childhood joys were collateral damage? The wind chime jingled again, faint and melodic, a small defiance against the rigid order imposed by paper and pen. I clenched the letter loosely in my hand, letting the smell of BBQ linger in my nostrils, and tried to anchor myself in something tangible, something warm. Somewhere beneath the snow, under the weight of locked gates and harsh rules, a fragment of holiday cheer still fought to survive. My daughter's voice cut through the gray winter morning like a fragile bell. "Why won't they let us play?" "Lily," whispered, her small face pressed against the cold metal of the gate. I felt a surge of something I hadn't fully acknowledged yet, anger sharp and simmering, wrapping around my chest like a vice. Her question demanded an answer, but all I had were pages of HOA bylaws and an archive of emails that seemed designed to frustrate rather than clarify. The office smelled faintly of coffee, the bitter aroma mingling with the chill seeping through the window frames. I sat at the worn desk, eyes scanning the HOA rules for any loophole, any oversight that could justify what had just happened. Karen's name appeared more often than I liked archived emails detailing petty bans, trivial disputes, and small power plays that taken together painted a picture of a woman determined to wield authority with a meticulous hand. Each line I read made my jaw tighten. Joan from the PTA leaned over my shoulder, her scarf pulled tightly around her neck. "You're not imagining it," she said softly, nodding toward the screen where an old email from Karen popped up. "There's a pattern. This isn't the first time she's gone after kids over minor infractions." Her words offered a flicker of hope, a reminder that I wasn't alone in recognizing the absurdity. I nodded, grateful for the quiet solidarity, even as my hands trembled slightly while I held the printout of the most recent email. I stepped outside to the playground, the winter light casting long shadows across the snow-dusted equipment. Karen was already there, clipboard in hand, intercepting neighbors who wandered too close. She smiled at them politely, but her eyes were sharp, scanning, cataloging every whisper and sideways glance. I noticed Joan, lingering near the entrance, exchanging a brief glance with me, a silent signal that we were aligned, even if the odds felt stacked. My camera phone was in my pocket, and I raised it slowly, taking a snapshot of the locked gate. The cold metal gleamed against the snow, a frozen monument to the petty tyranny I had been forced to endure. I scrolled through the archived emails, again screenshots ready to corroborate what I was documenting now. Each click of the shutter felt like a small act of rebellion, a way to preserve the truth before it could be twisted or dismissed. Back in the office, I spread the papers across the desk. Letters, screenshots, a map of the neighborhood playgrounds. I let my fingers hover over the documents, feeling the embossed stamps and faded ink. Each artifact told a story, the HOA's meticulous record-keeping, Karen's persistent interference, and my own mounting frustration. I could almost hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, a backdrop to my thoughts as they raced ahead to possible next steps. Karen's subtle interference became apparent when a neighbor approached to ask a question about snow removal. She quickly redirected the conversation, offering a partial answer while casting a glance that suggested surveillance rather than assistance. The message was clear. I could gather evidence, but I had to act smartly or risk being painted as the instigator. By mid-morning, the simmering anger began to shift into something more focused determination. I realized that leaving my children powerless was not an option. The documents in front of me, the emails, the snapshots, all converged into a single thought: I had to act. It wasn't just about the swings or the playground. It was about fairness, about standing up to an authority that had grown careless with its power. Joan brought over a cup of coffee, and I wrapped my hands around it, the warmth seeping slowly into my fingers. I allowed myself a brief pause, letting the aroma anchor me. This quiet moment of preparation was essential. It gave me a mental edge I hadn't felt in days. The gray winter light slanting through the blinds seemed to emphasize the stark contrast between the stillness around me and the storm building inside. I reviewed my notes one last time. Email timestamps the chain of events the faces of children denied their simple pleasures. The pattern was undeniable, and yet Karen remained blissfully unaware of the scrutiny gathering around her actions. It felt almost cinematic, the quiet tension of a snow-dusted playground, the faint hum of office lights, and my own pulse quickening as I imagined confronting this overreach with calm, meticulous evidence. By late afternoon, I had assembled a folder that felt heavier than any physical weight could justify. It was a compilation of injustice and hope, an inventory of wrongs waiting to be addressed. I looked out the window at Jamie and Lily, their heads bowed as they tried to make sense of locked gates and arbitrary rules. I clenched the folder a little tighter, letting the resolve settle in my chest. The path forward was clear. I could no longer remain a passive observer. Something had to give. Soon. I muttered under my breath, the words more a vow than a statement. The winter light had begun to soften, a faint promise of days to come, and for the first time since the gates were locked, I felt the nudge of hope beneath my frustration. The battle wasn't won, but at least now I knew it had begun. I pushed open the door of the suburban diner, the familiar jingle of the bell above announcing my entrance. The late spring air carried the faint scent of wet asphalt and blooming lilacs, but inside it was a different world. Dim lighting, the rich aroma of grease and coffee mixing with the low hum of idle chatter. Tom was already seated in a corner booth, his posture relaxed but attentive, a half-empty cup of coffee in front of him. Seeing him there after all these years, I felt a flicker of reassurance, a reminder that allies sometimes appear where you least expect them. "Garrett," he said, standing briefly to shake my hand. His grip was firm, familiar. A vestige of our days auditing city codes together. It's been too long. "What's got you sitting here at 9 on a weekday?" I slid into the booth across from him, the leather seat creaking under my weight. My hands shook slightly as I handed him the folder of documents I had assembled, HOA emails, notices of violation flyers about the playground restrictions, and my deed. The papers were neat, yet the edges curled slightly from being handled so often. I watched as the steam from his coffee swirled lazily into the air, mingling with the smell of fried onions and eggs. "I've run into a wall with our HOA," I said, voice low. "They've banned my kids from the playground, and the more I dig, the more it feels like a pattern, unjust, petty, and deeply entrenched." I gestured to the folder. "I need to understand if there's a way to push back." "Legally." Tom leaned back, folding his arms. "HOAs can be tricky, especially when they hide behind bylaws, but I've seen cases like this before. Your first step is knowing exactly where they overreach and what they can't defend." His eyes flicked over the papers, scanning the dates and stamps with the meticulousness I remembered from our city audits. "Here's what jumps out: notice dates, the way they've interpreted minor infractions, the inconsistencies in communication. There's a thread you can pull." I felt my chest tighten, but this time it was different. It wasn't panic, it was anticipation. I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth settle my nerves, and watched the faint curls of steam rise, a delicate reminder that even ordinary routines could anchor you in moments of uncertainty. "So you think there's a chance?" Tom gave a faint smile, not triumphant, but encouraging. "A chance? Definitely. But you'll need to be methodical. Organize everything. Emails, flyers, notices, anything that can prove a pattern. And don't forget the physical evidence, the gate, the playground, any signage. You need a narrative that's airtight, but human. The court, or even a strong appeal to the board, responds to clarity and consistency." I nodded already, imagining the steps ahead. Pulling the papers from the folder, I began arranging them on the table. The deed at the top, followed by emails, then flyers. Each document felt heavier than its weight suggested, as if the combined ink and paper held the injustices my children had faced. Karen's sharp presence loomed in my memory, the way she watched, clipped and calculating, as if each keystroke could cement her control. Document the timeline meticulously. Tom continued tapping the folder. Highlight where their actions conflict with bylaws, point out inconsistencies, and don't shy away from small, but telling details like the certified letter they sent right before Christmas. His gaze was steady, grounding me. "Show, don't tell. Let the artifacts speak." I exhaled slowly, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For the first time in months, a seed of confidence took root. I could see it clearly, a strategy forming from the chaos, a legal scaffolding to support our case. The moment wasn't grand, but it carried weight, the subtle empowerment that comes from understanding, from realizing that you're not entirely powerless. A waitress passed by, setting a plate of scrambled eggs near a couple in the next booth. The sizzle from the eggs mingled with the hum of the diner, an ordinary soundtrack to what felt like an extraordinary pivot in my life. I glanced at the papers, then back at Tom, and allowed a faint, almost sheepish smile. "I think maybe there's a way to fight back. Legally." Tom's expression softened, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Exactly. And once you start, you'll be surprised at how far a carefully documented case can go. But remember patience, precision, and calm. The board, like anyone else, responds to reason more than emotion." He leaned forward, tapping the top of the deed. "This is your anchor. Every subsequent document, every snapshot, every email you build around this truth." I picked up the deed, feeling the slight embossing beneath my fingertips, the corner curling from repeated handling. My pulse quickened not from fear, but from a mounting sense of agency. For the first time in weeks, the weight of inaction lifted slightly. Here was a mentor, a guide through the maze of regulations and petty HOA overreach, and with him, a framework for action. The diner's background chatter continued indistinct, almost comforting. Outside, a gentle spring rain began tapping against the windows, a rhythm that mirrored the tentative cadence of my plans. Each droplet felt like a marker in a timeline, a punctuation in the story I was finally beginning to write for my children's sake, and for our own sense of fairness. By the time we left the diner, I felt a cautious optimism swelling in my chest. My folder of documents had grown lighter, or perhaps it was my resolve that had lightened the weight. Walking to my car, I imagined the upcoming steps: organizing evidence, drafting letters, preparing for hearings. The path was still daunting, but the first glimmer of confidence, the empowering feeling of having a plan, was firmly in place. Maybe there's a way to fight back. Legally, I repeated to myself, not as a question this time, but as a quietly emboldened statement. The thought settled subtle but persistent, carrying me forward into the uncertain weeks ahead. The snow of previous winters had long melted, and in its place the spring thaw mirrored my own slow awakening, ready to confront what had seemed insurmountable. The envelope felt heavier than I remembered as I slid it into the mailbox that morning. My first official letter of objection, carefully typed and signed, outlining every inconsistency I had meticulously documented. Hours later, when it was returned to me, stamped in bold red letters, "Denied," a knot formed deep in my stomach. I had anticipated resistance, yes, but the stark finality of that rubber-stamped refusal hit harder than any casual dismissal could. The summer air clung to the skin, sticky with humidity, carrying the faint hum of distant lawnmowers. My backyard seemed smaller somehow, oppressive even as the sunlight made the wind chimes above the porch clink softly. I looked up prop symbol number 2. My faithful wind chime had a splintered corner. The thin tubes no longer sang their usual clear notes, but rattled unevenly in the breeze. Even the small things seemed complicit in the unraveling. That evening, I attended the monthly HOA meeting, hoping to at least witness reason among the board members. Karen was there, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the room like a hawk, occasionally flicking a glance in my direction that sent a shiver down my spine. I could almost feel the weight of her scrutiny before anyone spoke a word. The board nodded politely to neighbors, their smiles stiff, while a few of them leaned toward Karen as she whispered updates in hushed tones. I realized quickly that the room had changed, or perhaps it was my perception. Neighbors who once waved or nodded in passing now avoided my gaze entirely. Joan, the PTA ally who had previously offered a supportive smile, seemed tense, glancing at me as though unsure whether acknowledging my presence was dangerous. Murmurs floated just below audibility fragments of conversations, words twisted by the grapevine accusations of fussiness or obstruction. I clutched my papers tightly. The corners had curled from repeated handling, the ink slightly smudged from sweat. Mr. Garrett, Karen," said her voice calm but firm. "We've reviewed your objection thoroughly. The board has voted, and we must uphold the prior decision." Her words were precise, legalistic, but underneath them lay a current of triumph, as if each syllable reinforced a barrier between me and the community I had once felt part of. I left the meeting room quietly, the sticky summer air sticking to my shirt. Back home, I surveyed my backyard with a heavy heart. The wind chime. Prop number 2 hung crookedly on the porch, one tube dented, its song broken. It was a subtle fracture, but I recognized it instantly as a symbol. My connection to my neighbors, to my sense of normalcy, had begun to fracture too. I spent the evening documenting every interaction, every sideways glance, every whispered accusation I had caught. Screenshots of HOA emails, photos of the playground gate notes from my earlier meeting. These were my arsenal. Yet, for all the evidence, the sense of isolation gnawed at me. I felt a layer of scrutiny pressing from every corner, an invisible audience weighing judgment upon my actions. The neighborhood I had thought of as familiar now felt like a labyrinth designed to trap dissenters. The children sensed it too, I could tell. Jamie and Lily's questions were softer now, their laughter less frequent when we passed neighbors on our walks. Even Marlene seemed subdued, a shadow of concern behind her usual calm demeanor. Dinner was quiet, punctuated only by the scrape of utensils against plates and the occasional hum of the ceiling fan struggling against the humid air. I stood on the porch late that night, looking at the wind chime dangling precariously above. Its tubes caught the moonlight, revealing splintered edges that had not been there before. Each gentle gust rattled it unevenly, a fractured music that seemed to mirror my own mounting frustration. I reached out, running my fingers along the cold metal, wishing for the clarity it once represented. Was I truly alone in this fight? I whispered to the night, the words carried away by the summer breeze before anyone could hear. There was no reply, only the distant buzz of a streetlight overhead, the faint scent of my neighbor's BBQ smoke lingering from earlier in the day. Even in the familiar comforting smells, attention had settled, a reminder that perception was no longer aligned with reality. Later, I reviewed the HOA notices and flyers tacked to the community bulletin board. One slightly crooked detailed minor infractions with a tone that suggested vigilance rather than fairness. I could almost hear Karen's meticulous voice dictating the wording, her pen scratching invisible corrections in the margins. The paper crinkled from previous handling seemed to mock my attempts at rational discourse. Each artifact became a subtle indictment, a microcosm of the social isolation creeping around me. Sleep that night was fitful. I turned the scenarios over in my mind, a playground gate barred neighbors whispering the HOA's unyielding stance. In those dark, restless hours, my confidence from the diner meeting felt distant, almost naive. Yet, beneath the unease, a stubborn ember glowed. If I could identify the fractures both in bylaws and in perception, perhaps there remained a path forward. But tonight, that path seemed obscured by the shadows of mistrust and whispered judgment. The next morning, I returned to the porch. Prop number 2 swayed in the humid air, its uneven rattle echoing across the yard. I ran my hand over the tubes again, noting the way they bent under the weight of wind and heat. Symbolic, yes, but also grounding, a tangible reminder that the fight was not abstract. It was here, immediate, personal. And while I felt the sting of isolation, I also felt the first murmur of resolve to document, to act, to reclaim the narrative of our home and community. In the oppressive summer heat, with neighbors watching from behind curtained windows, I made a silent promise. The fractured wind chime above me would not remain broken forever. Somewhere in the stack of emails, the archived flyers, and the careful documentation, a strategy waited. And though I felt the first sharp edges of social ostracism, I understood one truth. Power like justice could be reclaimed one careful, deliberate step at a time. The envelope landed in my mailbox like a gauntlet thrown down in the spring sunlight. Its edges crisped the paper bearing the HOA's seal and a bold red ink stamp, Special Assessment Notice. My fingers shook slightly as I lifted it out, the scent of freshly cut grass mingling with the faint chemical tang of office ink from the printed document. I knew even before opening it that this was more than bureaucracy, it was a declaration: pay or face consequences. The backyard felt smaller that afternoon. Jamie and Lily played near the swing, their movements cautious, almost hesitant, as if sensing the tension hanging in the air. Marlene was inside, phone pressed to her ear, murmuring quietly, her eyes darting toward me every few moments. Outside, prop symbol number 2 still hung crookedly above the porch, its splintered tubes rattling unevenly in the breeze, a subtle reminder that the fractures in our household and neighborhood were deepening. I read the notice again, absorbing each paragraph. Late fees, fines, potential liens. My mind raced through numbers, scenarios, and worst-case outcomes. The financial pressure was immediate and tangible, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. But, alongside it, a spark of determination flared. This was no longer a minor dispute, it was about principal family and the sense of justice that had begun to fuel me months ago. The HOA office was a few blocks away, and as I walked toward it later that afternoon, I noticed a group of neighbors near the community bulletin board. Their whispers cut through the hum of spring insects and distant lawnmowers. Some faces were familiar. A few I had thought allies now exchanged glances with Karen, nodding subtly as if acknowledging an invisible authority. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to inhale deeply, letting the scent of fresh grass and warm sunlight ground me. Inside the HOA office, Karen sat at her usual station, clipboard and handpen poised. She didn't look up immediately, her sharp gaze trained on a set of papers in front of her. When our eyes finally met, I felt that familiar chill, a mixture of scrutiny and triumph, as if she could see the calculations, the tension, and the doubts swirling in my mind. The board members hovered nearby, expressions polite, yet guarded. I set the envelope on the table, spreading the documents carefully. There was no room for error. I began assembling the evidence I had meticulously collected over the years: certified letters, HOA flyers, prior meeting minutes, email printouts, even photographs of the swing set and playground gate. Each artifact represented a piece of the story, a counterweight to the narrative Karen had been weaving. My hands trembled slightly as I laid them out, the paper edges crisp but somehow ominous in the dim light of the office. "Mr. Garrett," Karen said, finally. Looking up, her tone clipped yet measured, "I hope you understand the implications of challenging the board." She tapped her pen against the clipboard, the click echoing in the small office. It was a sound I had come to associate with scrutiny and judgment, a metronome counting the seconds until confrontation. I nodded, swallowing the lump forming in my throat. "I understand. But this isn't just about fees or fines. It's about fairness for my family and the neighborhood." My voice carried more conviction than I felt internally, yet each word fortified the resolve that had been quietly building since meeting Tom months ago. Back at home, the children watched silently from the porch, sensing the gravity of the moment. I could see the questions in their eyes, the mixture of trust and worry. Marlene stayed close, offering a calm presence, but even she could not fully mask the concern etched across her face. I tucked the documents into a manila folder, the corners sharp beneath my fingertips, and allowed myself a brief glance at the wind chime above. Prop symbol number 2 rattled unevenly, its fractured music now almost a companion to my own adrenaline-fueled heartbeat. Later, I made the call. The law firm I had consulted months earlier confirmed the path I had already begun to envision: a formal lawsuit challenging the HOA's overreach. The voice on the other end of the line was professional. Even yet, I felt a surge of adrenaline with each step we outlined: filing forms, reviewing deed and easement, assembling affidavits. This was the culmination of months of documentation observation and cautious strategizing. The evening air settled in with a weight of finality as I signed the forms. The pen clicked against the paper, a sound that now felt like a starting gun, releasing a mixture of fear and exhilaration. My hands were slick with sweat, the ink smudging slightly, but I didn't care. This was commitment, a fully conscious leap into a fight that would define the next months of our lives. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. A few distant voices carried from the sidewalks, whispers of gossip mingling with the fading light. I caught the glance of a neighbor from across the street, eyes narrow, posture rigid. Even as doubt and tension clawed at me, I felt a pulse of determination. The stakes were now maximum: financial, social, and reputational. But retreat was no longer an option. Prop symbol number 2 swayed above me, fragile yet persistent, its uneven clatter in the spring breeze almost rhythmic. I traced my fingers along its metal tubes, acknowledging the metaphor it embodied: broken, yes, but resilient. Each paper in my folder, every email printout, every certified letter was another plank in a bridge, back to justice, fairness, and the reclaiming of control over our lives. I paused for a moment, inhaling the scent of fresh grass and the faint traces of Marlene's cooking from inside. The children were still observing quietly, eyes wide with unspoken questions. I offered a small, reassuring smile, more for them than myself. We were entering a new phase 1, where courage would be measured in paperwork meetings and unwavering attention to detail rather than physical confrontation. By the time the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the backyard, I had assembled everything: lawsuit forms, signed evidence, compiled mental notes, ready. The weight of the decision pressed down, but in it a strange clarity emerged. Fear and adrenaline intertwined, forming a strange resolve that propelled me forward. I set the folder on the kitchen counter, the papers slightly rustling, and looked once more at prop symbol number 2 above the porch. Crooked, splintered, rattling unevenly, yet it remained suspended in the air. It was an emblem of persistence, a reminder that even amid fractures one could hold firm. There was no turning back now. The hall smelled faintly of pizza, drifting from a cafe down the street, mingling oddly with the antiseptic scent of folding chairs and varnished wood. I clutched my folder tightly, the papers slightly trembling under my fingers, and took a deep breath. Today was the day, the culmination of months of meticulous documentation, endless emails, and carefully photographed evidence. The HOA board was here, seated stiffly at the front, their smug expressions familiar, yet now tinged with a nervous energy that I hadn't noticed before. Karen sat at the far end, clipboard still in hand, her lips pressed thin. The sneer I had come to expect was faltering, as if she sensed the shifting tide in the room. Neighbors began to filter in, some lingering in doorways, others taking seats with curious glances, whispering among themselves. Their murmurs were low, but unmistakable. Curiosity and quiet solidarity in equal measure. Prop symbol number 2. The wind chime above our porch, still hanging crooked and splintered, echoed in my mind as a metaphor: fragile, yet enduring, rattling in the breeze of justice about to arrive. The judge called the proceedings to order, her gavel producing a firm click that resonated through the hall. I rose and approached the front table, presenting the folder of evidence I had assembled so painstakingly. Each document had its place: the deed showing rightful property boundaries, easements granting access, certified letters tracing months of communication, even the HOA violation notices that had been so arbitrary and punitive. "I'd like to submit these as part of the official record," I said, voice steady, despite the adrenaline racing through my veins. The judge nodded, flipping through a few pages while Karen's eyes flicked over the top of her clipboard, scanning, calculating, faltering. The inspector, my brother, who had agreed to testify, stepped forward. He carried his own credentials, papers stamped, and signed, a quiet authority in his posture. He began to outline his observations, confirming the measurements of the property, the legality of our easement, and the discrepancies in the HOA's prior notices. His voice was calm but firm, each sentence punctuated by the soft murmur of neighbors leaning in, eyes widening, recognizing what they hadn't seen clearly before. Karen shifted uncomfortably, whispering under her breath to a board member. Her clipboard rattled as if in protest. I noticed the subtle tightening of her jaw, the brief flash of irritation before she forced a polite smile at the judge. The room, once tense with the unknown, began to tilt. The whispers grew more, neighbors daring to speak softly to each other. I thought it was just us. Or they really were wrong. I felt my chest expand slightly, a long-held breath releasing, but I didn't dare relax completely. Every piece of evidence, every letter, every photograph had to land perfectly. I gestured to the certified letters, the previously dismissed flyers, and the easement documentation. The judge examined each, occasionally nodding, making annotations with the sharp scratch of her pen. Each mark was a small victory, a micro-acknowledgement that our months of preparation were paying off. The micro-climax arrived quietly, but undeniably, the judge looked up from the last page, scanning the room. "The documentation presented is comprehensive," she said. Her words were measured, but to me they carried the weight of a thunderclap. "It appears that the claims of the HOA may have been overextended, and the restrictions imposed warrant review." Relief rippled through me, subtle at first, then stronger. My brother's nod, almost imperceptible, reinforced the moment. The validation was real, professional, and irrevocable. The neighbors' whispers grew into low murmurs of acknowledgement, and I could see understanding dawning in their eyes. Karen's expression, so long a mask of superiority, faltered completely. She pressed her lips together, glanced at the board members, and for the first time I noticed her hesitation, a crack in the armor she had meticulously built. I glanced at prop symbol number 2 again, visualizing it swinging above our porch. Though fractured, it remained in place. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Something broken could still endure. Resilience and evidence meticulously gathered could prevail against obstinacy. I felt a surge of catharsis, a long-held tension finally unspooling in a mixture of triumph and relief. The judge continued with procedural remarks, but my focus shifted to the reactions around me. Neighbors exchanged looks of quiet vindication. Some shook their heads incredulous at the lengths we'd gone to defend fairness. Others offered subtle nods, small gestures of support that resonated more profoundly than applause ever could. It was a moment of communal recognition of justice acknowledged not only in law, but in shared human sentiment. Karen leaned back slightly, the clipboard now limp in her hands. Her earlier composure had dissipated. The faintest furrow of worry lined her brow. She had been confronted with an irrefutable compilation of facts, each one carefully documented, each one demonstrating a narrative that contradicted her assertions. I felt no glee in witnessing her discomfort, only the satisfaction that truth painstakingly pursued had found its mark. Even as the proceedings wound down, I remained standing, folder in hand, absorbing the scene. The micro-clicks of pens, the soft rustle of papers, the murmurs of neighbors, all of it composed a symphony of resolution. Months of tension, legal wrangling, and social isolation were converging into a tangible, observable moment of victory. Finally. They saw the truth, I whispered to myself, not loudly, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement of the journey. It was an unspoken bond between the artifacts, the community, and our family. The fight had been arduous, the stakes had been high, and yet reasoned persistence had prevailed. Walking back to the car, later, the sun warming my back, I noticed the faint sound of a distant lawnmower, the subtle aroma of pizza still lingering. Life was continuing around the victory, mundane yet infused with a newfound sense of justice and possibility. The wind chime still cracked, tugged gently in the summer breeze, its uneven notes a reminder of resilience, evidence, and the subtle satisfaction that even small acts of courage could shift the balance. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a deep, unhurried breath. Relief tempered by recognition of the work still ahead mingled with a spark of hope. The community had witnessed fairness. The board had been confronted. The neighborhood now had a tangible example of accountability. As I drove home, I glanced at my children playing in the yard, faces bright with curiosity, and the unspoken recognition that they had been central to the fight. Marlene waved from the porch, a quiet smile crossing her face. The catharsis was complete, ha-hey, yes, but more profoundly a restoration of balance and acknowledgement that we were not powerless. The crisp autumn breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves rustling across the backyard as I set my tools down on the worn picnic table. Tom had returned not just as a mentor, but as a steadying presence, his calm demeanor a counterbalance to the months of tension that had weighed on the neighborhood. He surveyed the rickety swing set and the crooked wind chime, nodding thoughtfully before gesturing toward the small group of neighbors who had drifted over, curious but hesitant. "I think it's time for some small gatherings," Tom said, his voice low but confident. Potlucks, shared projects let people see cooperation, not confrontation. He glanced at me with a knowing smile, and I felt a flicker of hope. If the previous year had been about proving legal points, this season was about restoring trust, one careful step at a time. I picked up the hammer, feeling the familiar grain of the wood beneath my fingers. Prop symbol number 2. The cracked wind chime hung awkwardly above the porch. Today, it would get attention. As I started adjusting the split piece, neighbors stepped closer, offering nails, boards, and advice. One elderly gentleman held the ladder steady, while a mother handed me a small bag of screws, her eyes bright with the cautious optimism that seemed to ripple quietly through the group. Karen watched from the edge of the yard, clipboard still in hand, but her posture had shifted. She was no longer leaning forward aggressively, no longer scribbling notes that might be used as ammunition. Instead, she lingered, observing, eyes narrowed, but calm. The absence of overt hostility felt strange, but I allowed myself to notice it. Perhaps even she had sensed that the tide of the neighborhood had shifted, that quiet collaboration was now more powerful than confrontation. Tom guided me through each step of the repair. "Don't just hammer and patch," he advised. "Make it visible. Let people see the effort. Community buys in when they feel included." His words were practical, yet they carried a deeper lesson about trust and shared ownership. As we worked, I caught glimpses of the neighbors' soft smiles, the subtle nods exchanged over small successes. Even the children, who had been largely absent from the HOA battles, began to peek over fences, curious about the activity. The microclimax arrived quietly. As I tightened the last bolt on the wind chime, it swayed gently in the autumn breeze, the broken segments aligned and supported by fresh wood. The chime produced a tentative note, imperfect but harmonious. Neighbors gathered around, murmuring approval, and I felt the influence I had worked so hard to restore returning in small, tangible increments. They were watching, yes, but now with respect rather than suspicion. Karen took a step closer, lingering near the edge of the gathering. She didn't speak, didn't attempt to interfere, but I noticed a subtle relaxation in her stance. Perhaps the quiet display of cooperation had tempered her impulse for control. It was a minor shift, but meaningful. The authority I had fought to assert legally now began to translate socially, subtly balancing the power that had been skewed in the previous years. Tom clapped me gently on the shoulder. "See, this is how it begins. One repaired chime, one shared project, one visible act of collaboration. Momentum builds when it's tangible." I nodded, absorbing the lesson. This was not about winning or losing anymore. It was about restoring equilibrium, creating spaces where trust could take root again. I glanced around the yard, taking in the scene, the repaired wind chime hanging proudly, neighbors chatting quietly while kids chased each other among fallen leaves, Marlene carrying a tray of warm cider for anyone who wanted it. The air was alive with small gestures that hinted at reconciliation. The subtle smiles, the tentative offers to help, the unspoken acknowledgement of past wrongs, all of it wove a tapestry of quiet restoration. Even Karen remained stationary, clipboard at her side, her expression neutral but attentive. I realized that she had become a witness rather than an active antagonist. The dynamics had shifted, the board's influence was no longer absolute, and my own position within the neighborhood had been quietly reinforced. I allowed myself a moment to savor this subtle balance of power, recognizing that it was fragile but real. As the afternoon waned, leaves drifting down in lazy spirals, I felt a sense of release, a lifting of tension that had been coiled within me for years. The prop symbol, once cracked and contentious, now stood as a visual metaphor for repair and reconciliation. Its notes, imperfect yet persistent, resonated across the backyard, mingling with laughter and the distant rustle of trees. "Maybe we can finally breathe again," I murmured under my breath, more to myself than anyone else. The phrase hung lightly in the air, carried away on the crisp breeze, yet it captured a moment of collective exhalation. The legal battles, the whispered judgments, the social isolation. They were not entirely gone, but they had been mitigated by deliberate, visible acts of cooperation. The wind chime's tentative tone seemed to echo this sentiment, fragile but present, signaling a future in which balance and trust could be rebuilt. Tom gave me a small, approving nod before packing up his tools. "Keep it visible. Keep it tangible," he reminded me. "The small steps matter more than you think." I watched him leave a steadying influence fading into the autumn light and felt a renewed commitment to maintaining this fragile equilibrium. Neighbors lingered, chatting, sharing smiles, offering small bits of advice about future projects. The atmosphere had softened the tension diluted by participation and acknowledgement. It was a moment of quiet victory, of subtle assertion of fairness, of shared effort that transcended prior conflicts. I allowed myself to step back, breathe, and simply observe, appreciating the delicate recalibration of social power and community trust. As dusk approached, the yard glowed softly in the fading sunlight, the wind chime swaying gently, its repaired notes ringing faintly yet clearly. I knew the journey was not over, but for the first time in years a sense of equilibrium had been restored, a quiet reassurance that justice, collaboration, and persistence could coalesce into tangible, lived experience. Christmas Eve 2023 arrived with a delicate hush over the neighborhood. The first light dusting of snow sparkled on the playground, reflecting the twinkling holiday lights that adorned fences and rooftops. My kids, Jamie and Lily, ran freely across the swings and slides, their laughter echoing against the crisp winter air, a sound I hadn't heard so unrestrained in years. For the first time in nearly a decade, the playground was theirs again. Above the newly repaired swing set prop symbol number 3, the wind chime hung perfectly, its delicate notes jingling in the cold breeze. Its sound was clear and unwavering, a silent testament to perseverance and restored harmony. Neighbors drifted in mugs of steaming cocoa in hand, their smiles soft but genuine. The air was warm with camaraderie, the tension of past disputes replaced by the comfort of shared celebration. I handed small gifts to the children, their faces lighting up with pure joy. Marlene stood nearby, her cheeks rosy from the cold, smiling at the scene with a quiet satisfaction. The accumulated emails, letters, and notices, once the instruments of stress and conflict, were now archived neatly in my office, no longer a source of anxiety. The HOA had accepted the outcome, their previous overreach a distant memory in the shared experience of the community. Karen lingered at the edge of the gathering, her clipboard nowhere in sight. She observed silently, no words, no gestures. Her previous authority dissolved in the quiet acknowledgement of the neighborhood's consensus. She had become a witness rather than a participant in the harmony unfolding. I caught her glance and without a word nodded toward the children playing. There was no hostility, no need for confrontation, just an unspoken recognition that the small power she had wielded was gone. I took a moment to breathe, noticing the crunch of snow beneath my boots, the sharp aroma of pine from a nearby yard, and the soft glow of lights reflecting off frost-laden branches. The wind chime's sound mingled with the laughter of children, creating a symphony of quiet victory. Even the coffee cups, long forgotten on the picnic table, held the warmth of shared effort and celebration, a small but tangible reminder of countless meetings, repairs, and letters that had brought us here. The micro-climax arrived subtly. Watching Jamie lift Lily onto the swing, their small hands gripping the chains with confidence, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The legal battles, the whispered judgments, the social isolation, they had all culminated in this moment of pure, untainted joy. Justice had been served not with confrontation or force, but through patience, persistence, and the quiet assertion of fairness. Mentor Tom appeared once more, quietly observing from the edge of the yard. He offered a small approving nod, his eyes twinkling with satisfaction. His guidance had extended beyond strategy. It had instilled the confidence to act, the patience to repair, and the wisdom to understand that reconciliation could be as powerful as any legal victory. The wind chime, now perfectly balanced and sonorous, symbolized this lesson. Fragile structures carefully tended could endure and flourish. Neighbors mingled naturally, exchanging stories and greetings. Small acts of collaboration, sharing cookies, helping hang lights, offering advice on minor repairs, wove a tapestry of restored trust. The previously tense relationships had softened, replaced by acknowledgement and celebration. It was a community reborn from patience and perseverance, each person a participant in the healing process. I walked among them occasionally, offering a warm smile, a pat on the shoulder, a word of thanks. The children's laughter seemed to radiate outward, uniting everyone present. Even Karen's quiet observation was absorbed into this harmony, her presence no longer a source of tension, but a reminder of the journey we had undertaken together. The power she once exerted had been peacefully neutralized without argument or spectacle, leaving only the joy of the neighborhood restored. As the afternoon faded into evening, the snow glimmered under strings of lights, the wind chime swaying gently above, producing a melody that resonated with the past, present, and promise of the future. I felt a deep sense of contentment, a mixture of relief, pride, and quiet triumph. The playground, the children, the repaired chime, and the smiling faces of neighbors, all of it coalesced into a tangible proof that patience, diligence, and integrity could reclaim not just structures but community spirit. I knelt briefly beside Jamie and Lily, brushing snow from their coats. "We did it," I whispered more to myself than to them. Their eyes sparkled, oblivious to the complexities that had led to this moment, yet fully immersed in its joy. The small victories, the legal papers filed and archived, the repaired prop symbols, and the reconciled neighbors had produced something far greater than I could have imagined: the restoration of trust, joy, and shared ownership of our community. As darkness settled and the twinkling lights shimmered against the winter sky, I looked around the yard, the wind chime above ringing faintly with each passing breeze. Every laugh, every smile, every careful gesture of goodwill affirmed the path we had taken. There was no drama, no final confrontation, only the serene satisfaction of justice achieved, harmony restored, and hope fully realized. We had finally reclaimed our small piece of joy, I thought, letting the words settle as I watched the children swing freely. It was a Christmas Eve like no other, a culmination of effort, perseverance, and quiet courage. The playground was theirs, the neighborhood united, and the wind chime rang clear. A perfect note, signaling that healing had arrived. The playground gate stays open at last, and the repaired wind chime sings above, crisp and steady. A small plaque now names the playground neighbors, nodding with quiet pride as they hang decorations and share cocoa. Justice isn't loud. It grows through care, patience, and a willingness to show up together. We reclaimed more than swings. We rebuilt trust, laughter, and the simple rhythm of community. If your street feels muted under rules or notices, remember small hands, kind neighbors, and persistence can restore both play and peace. What stories of quiet victory have you seen in your neighborhood lately?